Good evening, and welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. My name is April Federico. I am a first-year student and a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other devices that might make noise. Tonight we will be hearing from Fiona Hill, Director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. From 2006 to 2009, she served as a National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is a frequent commentator on Russian and Eurasian affairs and has researched and published extensively on issues related to Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and strategic issues. Tonight, she will be discussing her recent book, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. There will be a book sale and signing after the program. Following Ms. Hill's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please wait until the student ambassador with the microphone reaches you before beginning your question. Without further ado, please welcome Fiona Hill.
I'd like to say thank you very much to April for such a very nice introduction, and also I'm very pleased to be here. I tried to come here once before, but I got stopped by a tornado. And I was a little bit worried this morning. I thought that Mr. Putin was somehow having meteorological impact here, because Washington DC was completely swathed in fog, and that already the planes were starting to get delayed as I got there, but I'm very pleased to get here. So thank you. And thank you to all of you who might have attempted the first time to come. I think one person actually made it through all of the terrible weather, so if you're in the audience, I'm really sorry. Anyway, I'm here now. And it's also a little strange because the initial presentation was going to be much more linked to the big political event that you all had here, which I keep admiring all the pictures of around, about the primaries and the election season. Well, everything's moved on. We know next it's Indiana and then it's California. Well, what's interesting is Mr. Putin has made an appearance in this election. He seems to be Donald Trump's favourite person, Hillary Clinton's least favourite person, and he himself seems to be making a few pronouncements, at least through his proxies in the Russian media and on Russian television, about how he might like to have the outcome of the presidential election. It will be no surprise that he seems to have a preference for Donald Trump. And I thought that perhaps in the Q&A, if anybody's interested, we might talk about that a little bit more as to what's going on here. But I thought I would start by giving you a little bit more an idea of what kind of a person Vladimir Putin is. I'd actually thought that perhaps we might have a little bit longer of a Q&A, because I'm sure that given the fact that he keeps making these appearances all over the place, in his own country and here, you might have lots of different questions about him. So I'll just, again, give you a little bit of an idea of just what this man is about. Now, excuse me one second. There's a bit of an obsession with Putin on all different levels. And part of the reason for this is that the Russian residential system is incredibly personalized. Vladimir Putin is not a member of a political party. He doesn't have, like you in the Soviet period, a Politburo or a collective leadership, a formal leadership around him. It's just really Vladimir Putin. In some respects, he kind of resembles an American president in the fact that there's a direct election for him. So, just to be clear, elections in Russia do matter. And in 2018, Vladimir Putin has to put himself up for election again. And in the meantime, this year, at the end of this year, in 2016, there are going to be elections for the Russian parliament. The Russian parliament actually has very little to do with Putin, but often the Russian parliamentary election can cause some problems. And you might recall that in 2011, in December, there was another parliamentary election in Russia. The election was supposed to be won rather resoundingly by the leading Russian party, United Russia, which was at least nominally associated with Putin. And things went a little wrong. United Russia didn't do very well in the elections. In fact, they didn't reach the predicted votes that they were supposed to get in Moscow and a whole host of other cities. And they tried to do a little bit of manipulation of the vote, which was all caught on social media. Vladimir Putin notoriously doesn't bother with the internet, and he actually stacks lots of information on the internet, but he notoriously doesn't use an iPhone or any kind of phone, he says. I think he actually still has a big deck of those big red phones that we saw back from the Soviet period, so if there's any disaster, he has to pick up one of the many phones. But other than that, he hasn't really quite moved into the high-tech world. So he was a little shocked and surprised when some of the violations of this electoral ballot stuffing and some of the other efforts by United Russia supporters to manipulate the election got captured on social media and ended up being, essentially broadcast around the country, resulting in protests. And the poor performance of the party also gave the suggestion that maybe Putin himself might have been in trouble in 2012 when he decided that he wanted to come back into the presidency again. So Putin has already been through an election campaign, a series of election campaigns, that have made him a little bit nervous. So there's a lot of speculation in Russia right now about what's going to happen in this presidential election. It's not quite a bit of a nail-biter that we have here at the moment. Pretty much people are assuming that Putin is going to run for re-election again in 2018 and will be elected again. We might not know exactly what the vote is, but let's just say right now it looks very likely that Putin is going to be with us till 2024. Which is quite a long time. There's not meant to say that he is, but let's just say that when I'm talking about Vladimir Putin right now, we might be really spending a long time with this gentleman. And unlike in the United States, where there are two rather fixed term limits, technically Putin now has the choice of these two consecutive 6-year terms. So Putin is actually already into his 3rd term as president, and then he will have a 4th term. He had to step away between 2008 and 2012, and he was Prime Minister for that period, but I don't think anybody would say for a second that Vladimir Putin went anywhere. Now, the one thing about Putin that really makes him very different from any other international leader, apart from this hyper-personalization and central role of the president in the Russian political system, is the one that you all know anyway, that Putin was a KGB agent. His first career, immediately after he left university, was to join the KGB. For those of you who are completing your degrees here and thinking about the next phase of your career, I'm not sure I'd recommend the KGB to you. But Vladimir Putin had decided quite early on, before even he went to university, that he wanted to join the KGB. There's a story that, of course, he himself has told, so we don't really know whether it's really true, because Vladimir Putin tells quite a lot of stories about himself. That when he was sometime in high school, he went and knocked on the door of the local recruiting agency for the KGB. I always have a hard time envisaging what that building must have looked like. You know, you're walking down the street in a strip mall, you know, kind of equivalent. You see a door that says, you know, KGB apply here. Somehow I don't think so, but in any case, Putin seems to have located his local KGB recruiting office, or at least the local office of the KGB, and gone in and said he'd like to join. And he was told he was a little young. So he asked what he should do, and for those of you in the audience who are lawyers, you might have a little shudder here. They suggested you go off and get a law degree. They said it was the best preparation for joining the KGB. So Putin goes and gets a law degree, and he makes a very fateful set of contacts on his course to doing his law degree. His mentor, the head of the law faculty at what was then Leningrad State University, later St. Petersburg, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was a gentleman named Anatoly Sobchak. Anatoly Sobchak was a very interesting gentleman. He was an expert on constitutional legal theory. And in 1993, Sobchak was actually asked to be one of the drafters of a new Russian constitution after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he applied all of his knowledge about constitutional legal theory from the 19th century when a group of Russian lawyers were trying to figure out how to make Russia a constitutional monarchy and to try to circumscribe the monarchy, the Tsarist system. Anatoly Sobchak created a constitution that made the president essentially like a constitutional monarch. So in some respects, Putin is the beneficiary of this constitution created by his former law professor, who created a constitutional arrangement that makes him a little bit like a modern Tsar. So all of you here should be very nice to your professors, because you never know who they might become later. Even better than that, Anatoly Sobchak became the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, sorry. As we're sitting here in the Institute of Politics, again, you know, as students here, you should be quite careful on who you get to be your professors, because Sobchak then recruited from many of his former students from Leningrad Law Faculty, including Dmitry Medvedev, you might remember was briefly president for a period when Vladimir Putin nominated him. That's the people that he recruited his mayoral team from. So Putin went on to be a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg with Anatoly Sobchak. And then later, when Sobchak lost his re-election in 1996, some of Putin's colleagues who had worked in the mayor's office with him helped find him a job in Moscow. So it's all about networks and the people that you get to know. But the most important part of the career, instead of just the networking with former law faculty and Mayor Sobchak, was Putin's time in the KGB. Now, he wasn't a very successful KGB officer, it seems. It took him quite a while to get to go to the KGB Academy in Moscow, the Red Banner Institute, and it took him a while also to get an interesting posting. He spent a lot of his time in Leningrad doing all kinds of rather unpleasant things, trying to blackmail and recruit business people visiting from the West and Western diplomats, the so-called honey traps, which often involved organised crime and lots of rather unpleasant situations. But in the 1980s, Putin gets a posting to Dresden in East Germany, and he's there from 1985 to 1990. This is a particularly auspicious period in the Soviet Union, and Putin misses it. So he's basically in Dresden in East Germany from 1985 to 1990, which is the peak of perestroika and Mikhail Gorbachev's period. Mikhail Gorbachev just celebrated his 85th birthday recently. It's been 25 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course he's been a very consequential figure in our history, as well as in Russian and Soviet history. But perestroika, the whole opening up of the Soviet Union that started the reform movement that Mikhail Gorbachev oversaw, which ultimately, I guess, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of the high points of this happened while Putin was in Dresden, in East Germany. And one of Putin's jobs in Dresden was to follow the opposition to the East German leader of the time, Erich Honecker, who wasn't especially very popular. And Dresden was a hotbed of opposition to Honecker. And he was also supposed to be tracking down, again, West German business people, trying to steal secrets from the CIA, all the kinds of things that you might imagine an agent doing there. And working very closely with the East German security services, the East German intelligence, the Stasi. Now, Putin doesn't really remember this period with a great deal of fondness, because in 1989, of course, the Berlin Wall fell, and there was a huge backlash against Erich Honecker and the German intelligence and also the KGB in the period leading up to that. And Putin himself has extraordinarily bad memories of basically mob protests just outside of the Stasi headquarters near the KGB building where they had their offices, and of having to go out and actually deal with a crowd that he thought was going to storm the building at one point while his boss was away. So Putin has a bit of a phobia about mass political demonstrations and also the idea of opposition movements on the street, which really explains why he had such a negative reaction to what happened in 2011 and 2012 around the elections to the Russian parliament and his re-election as president. And when Putin came back from the KGB, posting in Dresden in 1990, he came back to a Soviet Union that was already in its last year of existence. So Putin talks about that period of perestroika, glasnost, and all the things that we think of as being very positive developments in the Soviet history, as being very negative, because he comes back to a Soviet Union that's about to collapse. And you may remember that in some speeches he's talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union as being the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. What he means by that is the collapse of the state. Now next year there'll be another anniversary of state collapse, the anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And interestingly, Putin has also talked about that revolution, without which of course he wouldn't be Russian president, but nonetheless in very negative terms. Putin has actually talked about the revolutionary leaders, including Vladimir Lenin, who is still, of course, embalmed in the mausoleum on the Red Square, as being a traitor. Because in his view, Lenin, he said this very carefully, of course, because there are still many former communists who would think about things quite differently, and Lenin is still something of a symbol of the state. But he's very strongly implied that Lenin had betrayed the country, betrayed the state, the Russian state, the old Russian Empire, by leading an insurgency during war. And then famously came back to St. Petersburg in 1917 in a sealed train from Germany. For those of you who've been studying Russian history, you'll probably remember this, to the infamous Finland station to give a big speech that I think actually not too many people showed up for, but nonetheless, he was kind of coming back to lead a revolutionary movement. And Lenin basically was assisted in returning to the Russian Empire, to Russia at the time, by the Germans, who were of course engaged in a war in this period with the Russian Empire. So Putin has made a lot of references to this, and has often said in the last couple of weeks that he hopes that St. Petersburg won't be the scene of another revolution in 2017. So you can see that there's a lot of nervousness starting to creep in with these big anniversaries start to approach, especially as 2017 will be right in the middle of the Russian parliamentary elections and the Russian presidential elections. Because this is a direct democracy in some respects in Russia, Putin has to be re-elected in 2018 to be able to stay with us till 2024. And he has to have, in some respects, a resounding result. He has to be able to show to the people around him, not just to the Russian population, that he is still the main person within the whole system. And this is where Putin tries to draw upon the skills that he learned in the KGB. There are two skills that he said that he learned that he thinks are the most valuable, in fact, for a political candidate and a president, not just for a KGB officer. They are working with people and working with information. Now, none of those references are actually particularly, let's just say, straightforward. Working with people means blackmailing people, or at least getting people to do things that you want them to do that they don't want to do, or stopping them from doing things that they want to do that you don't want them to do. In other words, it's manipulation. And working with information is trying to use information in a way that it furthers your purposes, which of course is an element of propaganda or an element of political persuasion. So Putin tends to approach most of his political activity as if it's a kind of constant campaign. I like to think of Vladimir Putin as a super political action committee, as a super PAC. So Putin engages a lot in negative campaigning and negative messaging, and also in downright manipulation of events to really push forward his message. And as far as Putin's concerned, there's nothing wrong with this. This isn't a character flaw. This is what politics is about. And Putin is constantly referring, in fact, to our election at this moment and pointing out that this is the same kind of activity that he's seeing in US politics. Putin is really the kind of the master machine politics. And we see that in the run-up now to his own elections, and the parliamentary election of this year, and then the presidential election ahead, that he's sending out an awful lot of messaging. Part of that messaging is that we, the United States, are out to get him. Which is why he's paying an extraordinary amount of attention to the messaging that's going on in our presidential election about how Russia is likely to be dealt with, which is where Donald Trump comes in, as I mentioned at the very beginning. Putin finds quite appealing the message that is being sent, at least so far, by Donald Trump, about the idea that there might be a reset, his kind of version of a reset of relations with Russia, that the United States won't be paying so much attention to alliances, and that there might in fact be a whole different tone to the relationship. Now, why is that important for Putin? I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, but for Putin, he really does see that there is a double standard by the United States. So Putin, when he came into power in 2000, his mandate was to restore the position of Russia after a period of great collapse under Boris Yeltsin, of humiliation on the political front, internationally, Russia, the Soviet Union, being pushed out of all of the areas in which it had formerly dominated in past decades. Putin often says that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost its position in Europe. It obviously lost its position as one of the two superpowers. And Russia was also bankrupt. It was insolvent. And so Putin, when he came into power in 2000, he took upon himself the idea of restoring the role of the Russian state. First of all, restoring it at home, politically and economically. He benefited a great deal from the fact that oil prices rose from 2000 through to about 2008, the end of his first 2 terms as president. He was incredibly lucky. He was also assisted in restoring Russia's economic fortunes by one of his colleagues from Mayor Sobchak's office, the gentleman who had brought him to Moscow, first in 1996, Alexei Kudrin, who was probably one of the best finance ministers that any country really could have. And Alexei Kudrin helped to steward a whole period in the Russian economy from 2000 to 2008 of paying off debts with the revenue windfalls that were brought from oil and gas prices. That's not something that normally happens in most countries, not here and not in the country that I'm from originally, in the UK. When the UK struck oil and gas in the North Sea, we just spent through it all quite rapidly in a period of a couple of decades. And we've not been doing so good here either. Anyway, Putin and Alexei Kudrin, the people around him, remarkably conservative in their fiscal policies. They stashed away money for rainy days. Well, the rainy days are here now, and unfortunately they seem to be spending through it quite a lot right now. And they also were very careful to make sure that they paid off their debts. As I said, Russia was bankrupt in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin. There'd been a great deal of borrowing on international markets by Mikhail Gorbachev and also then by Yeltsin. And Putin paid off all the debt that Russia owed to the IMF, the World Bank, and to private sector debt in advance of the time frame, even paying penalties to pay that debt off. And that's when you start to see Russia reassert itself. So this is the period of 2004 to 2005, which is the period when the United States and its NATO allies enlarge the NATO alliance. It's also that period when the European Union enlarges to take in countries from the former Warsaw Pact, and some countries, the Baltic states, that had been forcibly part of the Soviet Union and previously part of the Russian Empire. And this is where Putin starts to really feel that he needs to start to reverse the course of world affairs and of interactions with the United States. Putin, for a long period of time, having been in the KGB and being in Dresden, seeing the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the whole Soviet bloc, has rather fond memories of the period when the Soviet Union was a superpower. He said that was, of course, the period of where he thought was his greatest hopes and aspirations. I mean, ironically, of course, he would never have been president under those kinds of circumstances. But he still nonetheless feels that this was the time when Russia was at its peak. 2004, expansion of NATO, enlargement of the European Union, for people like Putin and those around him, seems to be a slap in the face. But it's also the period when he starts to feel that actually Russia has a lot more going for it. The ability perhaps to flex its muscles in the way that it had not before. And some of you in the audience might remember in 2007, Putin gave a rather famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, which he was invited to. And it was basically a speech that we're just not going to take it anymore. We've had it. We see here that NATO and the European Union are now moving into our territory, the land of the old empire, the lands of the old Soviet Union. We don't like this, and we want it to stop. And the audience at Munich sort of scratched their heads like this and thought, well, okay, fine, but we're not a threat. We're not trying to do anything here that is going to be impinging on your interest. There was a whole feeling that this is the Cold War had ended. We were all moving together into a new strategic partnership with Russia, and Putin was just basically behaving like people might expect, some former KGB guy stamping his foot. What was Russia going to do about it? Well, in 2008, when the door to NATO was held open, although there wasn't an actual invitation to Georgia and Ukraine, Putin decided to do something about it. He had basically declared a red line, and he was going to make sure that that red line was enforced. So he gave us the August 2008 war with Georgia. Since then, Putin has been on a bit of a tear. I think we've all noticed this. It's actually been a little bit complicated for me because I wrote the first book about Putin, trying to explain some of the ways in which he operates in 2013. Basically by 2014, there was a war with Ukraine, he'd annexed Crimea, and all of this needed explaining as well. And since then we've had the intervention in Syria in 2015, and now we have Putin very much in centre stage in world affairs. He's become the elder statesman, if one could describe it like that, of international leaders. And only really Angela Merkel, as the Chancellor of Germany, has been in office anything that approximates any kind of time frame in which Putin has been in office. And Putin now really feels that he commands the international stage. He has restored the position of Russia both domestically and internationally. The problem for Putin is, like the problem for everybody else, is that the Russian economy has taken a real hit since 2013. The Russian economy has been in something of a downward spiral. All of the efforts to stabilize the economy and to stash money away for a rainy day between 2000 and 2008 and the period immediately afterwards have now reached some considerable difficulty. Oil and gas prices are low, they're rising a little bit, but Putin and the team around him know that the Russian economy can only really recover if oil prices continue to rise over time. So it's not just a factor of high oil prices. Growth in the Russian economy will only come from a steadily rising oil price. Now, I don't think anybody's very good at predicting oil prices, so I think we can be fairly certain that's not going to happen for some period. So they're all very nervously watching the situation. And so Putin has to make sure that he keeps things nice and stable at home, because he's got elections, and that he's for the parliament, he's got elections for the presidency, and he has to pass that electoral test. So as we're sitting here contemplating our own presidential election and what might happen in it, and where the future might take us, Vladimir Putin, ironically, the man who looks like the great authoritarian leader who seems to be set out till 2024, is also feeling quite nervous. So I think I'll leave it at that. It's 6:30, and I'd like to give all of you as much of an opportunity to let me know what's on your mind. If you have any thoughts about Putin as well, just let me know. I'm not planning on writing a third edition of the book, but maybe I'll get some ideas from talking to you about something else I can do. It's getting, quite. If I'm doing this until 2024, I'm going to be a bit tired, I think. But obviously, Putin is an infinitely interesting man, and there's an awful lot going on in Russia, and also in US-Russian relations, as well as global affairs more broadly. So I'm really very keen to hear what you might like to talk about more. So we have our two colleagues on either side. So just let me know if you'd like to say something, and if you'd just like to tell me a little bit about yourself as well, I'd appreciate that. So I know who's asking the question, and here at the front first of all. Thank you.
Hi, I actually haven't studied Russia, but I have studied the Middle East. And I'm just kind of curious, I just remember the time of the Olympics and everything coming out about Crimea and the Ukraine. I'm curious if Putin had any idea though that would break out right at that moment when of course all international attention was on Russia, or if that was not really planned and it just happened to turn out that way. Just curious if you had any thoughts.
I think the timing of the crisis in Ukraine, the Sochi Olympics, was something of a coincidence. However, I think Putin had a contingency plan in mind. So this is one thing about being in the KGB, you always plan. So Putin thinks about everything as kind of a mission or an operation. And you know that something always goes wrong. So just like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, just as he's dangling from that wire, trying to get whatever it is that he's trying to get, the wire snaps and all hell breaks loose. And Putin always assumes that something's going to go wrong. I don't think in the Sochi Olympics, when he was planning that, because of course that had been planned for years, that he quite thought there would be a massive crisis in Ukraine. When it comes to Crimea, there's been a crisis between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea, dating right back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine became an independent country, and Crimea was part of Ukraine, you might remember that Ukraine acquired Crimea in 1954 during what seems to be a bureaucratic transfer of the territory, the peninsula, from Russia to Ukraine inside the Soviet Union. So Ukraine had Crimea, and Crimea in Russian imperial history and also in Soviet history is a traditional home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is a pretty important military unit and a very significant symbol of the Russian and Soviet state. The Black Sea Fleet was based in the port cities of the Crimea, and one of those cities, Sevastopol, is probably one of the most famous cities in the whole of Russia. In fact, I was just in London last week, and I was walking with a Russian friend, and I wanted to go from this little aside for a moment, through the main streets of London, and on one of the streets, Pall Mall, which some of you might know where that is, just parallel to the mall, which runs down to Buckingham Palace, there's a very large statue. And on the side of that statue is written Crimea. And my Russian friend went, Crimea? And I said, yes, Crimea. There was Crimean War between Britain, France, and Russia back in the 1950s. And it was actually, many of you might have heard of Florence Nightingale. It was kind of, the Crimea was a bit of a disaster. Most people died actually from disease, and Florence Nightingale started off the nursing service. So any of you who are studying nursing here, thank you, Crimean War. And Florence Nightingale, she was also a great epidemiologist. But my friend didn't know about the Crimean War, which I thought was a little astounding actually, because she's pretty well educated. I guess that, you know, kind of that has been blotted out of kind of recent Russian history and discussions, because, you know, for a while Britain thought of Crimea as part of its, you know, kind of imperial history as well. So Crimea has been this place where a lot's been happening for a long period of time. In the early 1990s, there was an awful lot of Russian politicians who were pretty angry with the fact that Crimea had gone with Ukraine into basically a separate territory. And in the period between about 91 and 1994, there was a set of crises in Crimea. Political activists were dying, there was all kinds of demonstrations, there were sort of threats in the Russian parliament about retaking Crimea. And the Ukraine was under an awful lot of pressure at the time to relinquish its nuclear arsenal that it inherited from the Soviet Union, and also to give a long-term lease to Russia for the Black Sea Fleet. So in other words, you know, basically 20 odd years ago, we were in a major crisis also over Crimea. And ever since that time, although it was resolved by giving Crimea autonomy, and there was a memorandum signed with Britain, the United States and Russia to guarantee Ukraine's territory, that didn't actually work too well, did it? And basically, Crimea has always been at the forefront of debates in the Russian parliament. And it seems that Vladimir Putin himself had a personal hankering for going after Crimea if an opportunity arose. In fact, there's a whole documentary about this where Putin basically admits that it was his decision. And he even kind of suggests that his own family had a link to Crimea, which was again a surprise for most people, because although, you know, the stories about Putin are often a bit murky, he talked about his father rather a lot, and he'd never managed to bother to mention before the annexation really of Crimea that his father had apparently served in Crimea during conscription in the Black Sea Fleet. Most people are actually not really sure that really was Vladimir Putin's father who did this, but anyway, nonetheless, Putin's kind of put his father right in the centre of this history as well. So it seems that Putin really wanted personally to take control of Crimea. So when the crisis in Ukraine broke out in the run-up to the Sochi Olympics, it seems that he decided to put this contingency into play in the event that something happened in Ukraine. And of course there was the protests against President Yanukovych, there was the toppling of Yanukovych. Yanukovych fled the country, and Vladimir Putin moved right away to seize Crimea. I think the fact that he waited a little bit was to get the Sochi Olympics out of the way, but it seems very clear that at some point in the week or so preceding the annexation, or maybe 2 weeks preceding the annexation, that Putin already put a contingency plan that had been prepared at some point into play. So a very complicated and long-winded answer, but it just means that you know, Putin has always got lots of these things on his mind for a long period of time. Yes.
I studied Russian history for a bit in high school, and I was just wondering, you mentioned that Putin established a very niche cult of personality within his type of area, and I was wondering, on the off chance that he does potentially lose the election coming up, what do you think would happen? Would his cult of personality just dissipate, or would he come back with a vengeance?
Well, this is the big question that everybody's asking right now. Putin or not Putin? You know, he has the legal right, if he passes the election test, to stay till 2024. And most people can't imagine him leaving the scene at all now. And he's been there for 16 years, and you know, he'll have been a quarter of a century if we get to 2024. And there's a lot of rumours that maybe there might be a palace coup, because you know, people tend to think of him as a new czar. Although there might be an insurrection, I mean basically a rerun of 1917, a revolt from the street protests. And that would happen, and the scenario goes, and the way that some people are thinking about it, there's a massive economic crisis. well, Russia's already in an economic crisis. And if there's something that happens that basically removes Putin's popularity. So you might have seen in some recent newspaper articles that Putin's ratings in public opinion polls have dropped a bit. So they were about 88% a couple of months ago, and now they're 73%. Well, that's actually a pretty great rating. I'm sure that anybody in our presidential race right now would be ecstatic if the polls showed ratings like that. But for Putin, that's a bit of a problem. Because before the Sochi Olympics that you were mentioning before, Putin's ratings were also dropping. So he'd stepped away for a period of time to be prime minister between 2008 and 2012. And in 2010, it became quite apparent that his ratings were on a kind of a slope on the way down. And basically in 2010, 2011, so just about the time when the last elections for the parliament happened, Putin's ratings were about 64%, which again sounds pretty good, but not if you're in a situation where you are the only political figure in the political system. There's no alternative to Putin. I mean, there are no other basically political figures in Russia with any kind of national name recognition. Dmitry Medvedev, who was president for a period, as soon as he went back to being prime minister, people sort of forgot he was there. And so, everybody else is in the single digits. And the protests that we saw in 2000 and 2012 weren't really calling for anybody to replace Putin, they were just asking for more choice. They were kind of protests against the idea that they were just going to be stuck with Putin to time immemorial, or that there wasn't going to be any kind of new political figures emerging. So the drop in his ratings was more about people getting tired with him. It's kind of like he was getting stale as a brand. And so everyone in Russia is constantly watching Putin's ratings. So, if they go down to 73%, will they come back up again? What does Putin have to do to turn those ratings around? Well, he turned the ratings around last time with the Sochi Olympics, first of all, and then annexing Crimea. And his ratings tend to kind of go up whenever there's lots of news about, really dramatic events, and he's on the television all the time. So there's a Russian sociologist who's done a lot of really interesting polling analysis showing that, I think this is kind of the Donald Trump trick in the election. You say something really outrageous and immediately your ratings go up. Well, Putin does something outrageous and his ratings go up. And so this sociologist Kirill Rogov has actually tracked Putin's ratings. I mean, in some cases, it's kind of like little tiny ups and downs, along with major events from the war in Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea, and then the war in Syria. Now, Syria has been a big boost to Putin's ratings again, but now Syria, with the exception of the terrible things that are happening in Aleppo, has kind of tapered off a little bit. Remember, Putin intervened, and then he said, "Oh no, we're pulling out now." They haven't pulled out at all, but he kind of declared success, and there was a low phase of the military operations, and now all eyes are on the peace process. Well, Putin's discovered that peace doesn't make for very good news. I think actually most politicians realise that. So Putin seems to be, trying to make sure that he's in the centre of attention at all times. So this is really kind of the risk for him. The wild card in the whole political system is Vladimir Putin and his popularity, because this really matters a great deal. So in the elections, it seems very likely that if Putin is going to stand for re-election again in 2018, that he will win. The question will be, win by how much? Because he's made a situation where he has to win by some really dramatic amount, percentage. It's not quite 99.99%, but it clearly has to be in this rather stratospheric percentages for him to look like he's being successful. And when we look at the last election in 2012, we can actually see that Putin did not do all that well. When you look at voter turnout, and you look at the polling in, not just the polling exit polls, but focus groups and other polling that was done around the elections, and then you look at the actual results in Moscow and a group of other cities, you can see that probably Putin's national active support was probably just under 50%, maybe about 47%. It was definitely that in Moscow, which is the capital city. So, I mean, Putin was really kind of an outsider in his own city. Now, in any election, that's actually a pretty good percentage in a normal election, but Russian politics are not that normal. So the big question will be, if he's running again for re-election in 2018, can he really generate a big success? Now, right now, the opinion polls, even if they're in the sort of 73%, suggest that Putin's okay. But the question is really about the economy and all of the other issues that go around that. So it's going to be quite a tricky time for him. So just like in any other political setting, polling matters and the ratings matter. And the Kremlin is probably wondering, when they ask, you know, kind of an audience like yourself, do you like Putin, whether people are really answering honestly. Because if there's only him in the system, it obviously might not behoove you, might not be very safe to sort of say, well, no, actually, I like someone else. And the problem is there is no one else right now for people to really look at. I do think, however, that Putin is starting to groom a few people from his inner circle for maybe, you know, kind of candidates ahead who would have to, if he did decide to leave, guarantee that he would be able to, like Mikhail Gorbachev, live for a nice ripe old age after he leaves the presidency. Anyway, it's a great question, but I don't exactly have the answer, as you can tell. Yeah, at the back, please.
Thanks for coming. I wanted to see if you could touch a bit on, in the US we have a different idea of how politics runs nationally, but in Russia politics is also a dangerous game. I'm reminded of Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated in Moscow and was the main opposition leader of the parliament in Russia. So, and also there's tons of dissidents that flee Russia because they disagree with Putin. Next thing you know, they have a death warrant out against them. So can you speak to how dangerous it is to be a politician in Russia, and if someone were to rise to the occasion where they look as good or better than Putin, how they would navigate that quagmire?
Thanks. So that's another really good question. Now, Putin himself also believes that politics in Russia is very dangerous as well. And in the last few weeks, he's created a new National Guard. So he's kind of put in place around himself a group of forces that already existed out there, but he's basically reassigned them from different parts of the Ministry of the Interior and some other armed formations. I mean, Russia has a lot of paramilitary formations. And he's created something essentially, not a National Guard like a reserve force that we have here, but something that's meant to be his own force, and it has several 100,000 men under arms there. And he's put in charge of it a gentleman named Viktor Zolotov, who used to be the head of his own personal bodyguard up until 2013, and then was the head of the Interior Ministry. So that's kind of rather an interesting development, and it underscores, you know, exactly what you said, but it underscores that Putin himself feels rather nervous too. Putin has discussed on many occasions that he feels that if somebody loses power in Russia, then they're put against the wall and shot. He's actually used that as a term. Because it goes back into Russian history, obviously the history of Eastern Europe, you know, Ceausescu, and more recently, of course, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Putin was rather appalled by what happened to Gaddafi. And Putin has very bad memories, like many other Russians do, of October 1993, which was when Boris Yeltsin, who was in a standoff with the Russian parliament, decided to shell the Russian parliament, not exactly a very democratic act. At that time, Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and his boss, the mayor Anatoly Sobchak, who I mentioned before, his former law professor, and drafted the constitution, was actually quite opposed to Yeltsin's step. And for Putin, that was just, again, yet another affirmation that if you're, the politics in Russia is a permanent power struggle, and the people who lose, you know, literally get shot at. The death of Nemtsov that you described there was a great shock to everyone, and I have to say that for someone who's been basically studying Russia for 30 years, and I worked with Boris Nemtsov in the 1990s. I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard in the 1990s, and we had a bunch of technical assistance projects that we ran. One was with Boris Nemtsov when he was the governor of Nizhny Novgorod, a region out in Russia, that was kind of really a model, a pioneering model for reform, and we had a whole series of projects with him. He was a really true patriot of Russia. At one point he was a deputy prime minister, and he was even touted as being a potential successor to Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia in the 1990s. So this guy was the real deal. He was the one member of the Russian opposition who still had national name recognition, even if he wasn't, resounding percentage of ratings in public opinion polls. People knew who he was. He was the one person who was most likely to be able to rally people behind him in the event of, some kind of crisis, as you mentioned there as well. It's not at all apparent that Putin ordered his assassination, but it's very clear that someone from within the system did. That Boris Nemtsov was seen as a threat, that he could have been the person who kind of led up an insurgency, a grassroots movement from below, another revolution, in the event of the elections in 2016 for the Russian Parliament, and then maybe for the presidential election, because Boris Nemtsov always ran for election. And he was very heavily involved in the movement against the Russian operation in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, and had been producing a report showing the level of Russian state involvement in what was going on in the Donbass, the secessionist region of Ukraine, to pretty much show that the Russian military had been involved there. So this was a huge event, and as I said, for everybody watching this, was an enormous shock, because it certainly suggested again that threshold of violence had been crossed over. And it looked like Putin was shocked by it as well, because it showed again that there was more of an agitation and of an instability in the political system in the run-up to the elections, and a lot of infighting clearly in the groups in and around the Kremlin, and where he was killed on the bridge beyond the Kremlin walls was clearly a message to everybody in the Russian political system. So exactly as you point out, Russian politics is a very dangerous game. It's a blood sport. It's less bloody in current circumstances than it has been in the past. But that isn't any excuse for the kinds of levels of political violence we see. There's a great deal of intimidation of journalists, of anybody who really tries to speak out against things that they don't like. So I think we're in for some turbulent times ahead. Putin clearly thinks so, with the creation of the National Guard. And I think from here we also will have to be very careful about how we tread, because we are always used as a foil in this. The United States is always, the handy enemy to have on one side, just in case you need to justify any kind of act of repression. And most recently, Putin has been talking about efforts from the United States and the West to destabilize the political situation ahead of the elections. And that's another of the reasons he used for creating the National Guard, to prevent any kind of attempt from the outside to meddle in Russian politics. So again, it's going to be a big issue. Yes, so. Yeah, it's coming behind you.
Well, you have painted Putin in a very scholarly way, that his style of ruling is consequential to his upbringing in the KGB and all over. Many of my Russian acquaintances have entirely different, very, to some way, cynical point of view, thinking that he's very opportunistic and basically ruling over gigantic kleptocracy, which the sole purpose is to perpetuate power, so another layers of people can benefit on the being of the ruling group, and that goes on and on and on, and basically stability of his position is predicated on the how much he allows other people to benefit and how strongly they will support him, both in Kremlin and outside across Russia. Now, anecdotally, they think that Putin is one of the wealthiest person in the world, that his wealth is estimated somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. And you, as an insider, must have some opinion on that.
I do, yeah. I don't usually start with that topic, because it always comes up when I give presentations. I was actually a bit surprised that it hadn't already. When I was in London last week, that was obviously kind of quite a preoccupation because of the Panama Papers, which have ensnared actually Prime Minister Cameron for much lesser sums than billions, just tens of thousands of pounds, and created a bit of a political crisis for him. The stories of Putin's wealth and the wealth of those around him are very interesting, actually. when I first started doing a lot of research for the book, Putin was estimated at a few billion. By the time I got to the second edition, it was 100 billion, and you've now given me 200 billion. So obviously he's been doing very well for himself over the last few years. But what's interesting about this is a lot of the stories about Putin's wealth come from around the Kremlin. So many of the people who are the sources of this are Kremlin insiders. So there's a lot going on with this. Part of it is that the system itself is, as you described it, a kleptocracy. But it's one that's been deeply rooted and in fact goes back to the Soviet period. So if you look back to the 1970s in the Soviet Union, there's actually a very good book, I think it's still in print, written in 1982 by Konstantin Sinis, called The Corrupt Society. I mean, I don't know whether it'll be in the library here, but I read it back in basically the early 90s when I was a grad student doing my history PhD. And the book really describes how, in the 1970s, the KGB that Putin joined had basically become completely interpenetrated with organised crime in Leningrad. Because the whole point was that organised crime was the way to basically ensnare business people and diplomats through prostitution, illegal monetary transactions, you know, you name it. So Putin and the people around him were basically already joined at the hip with people of criminal gangs in Leningrad right from the very start. It's not to say that the KGB was running all of these, but just like the FBI and many other organisations have informants in it, they were deeply embedded. And actually, at some point, it does seem that the KGB were running some of the, according to Sinis's book and some other material from that time, were running some of the criminal operations there. Then you have the collapse of the Soviet Union in the basically early 1990s, on the whole question about what happened to the money of the KGB and the Communist Party that was either in Russia itself or stashed abroad. And it also is very clear, there's a book by Karen Dawisha, a professor from Miami University in Ohio, called Putin's Kleptocracy, that documents quite well, actually, where a lot of that money went. A lot of it was used to set up new businesses. And many of the organised crime figures became businessmen in different kinds of places. Putin and the people around him who have risen to the top of the state, and many of the people who were the oligarchs, the so-called oligarchs, the business people from the Yeltsin era, all took advantage of the collapse of the state and being able to pick up assets that were on a fire sale, particularly in the 1990s, and then reacquiring these assets over time. So when I've talked to people about this situation, I've had it described to me in this following way. So one person who's close to the Kremlin who I talked to for the book said, think Goldman Sachs. I was a bit surprised by this. Well, Putin recently said that actually the Süddeutsche Zeitung that published the Panama Papers was owned by Goldman Sachs, which wasn't actually true. But the reason that they picked Goldman Sachs was they said, think asset managers on a huge scale and bonuses. This is how these guys run this place. They think of themselves as the managers of the assets of Russia. Everybody's stolen. Everybody is equally as corrupt as the next person. Everybody who comes into the system is sort of bought into the system, and then they reward themselves with bonuses. And obviously Putin, as president, gets the biggest bonus. 100 billion, 200 billion, hard to say, but in any case, they've all got bonuses. The other thing is that Putin, his first job when he came to Moscow in 1996, when Alexei Kudrin helped him get a new job after he lost his job as deputy mayor when Sobchak didn't get re-elected, was in the Kremlin Property Agency. The Kremlin Property Agency pretty much owns everything. It has fleets of automobiles, it leases planes, it has palaces, it has dachas, it has hospitals, it has sanatoria, I mean, you name it. And it also, has at its disposal, pretty much access to anything. If they don't have it, they will get it for you. And Putin, like US presidents, if you get a nice gift, if it's over $25, you have to kind of hand it over, to the White House or to the State Department. You don't get to keep it afterwards. You can just assume that, kind of presidential gifts get kept. And, obviously they're all redistributed. Putin, basically in the property agency, got to know who got what, perks, and who did what with what. And in that period, this is the kind of the period that he comes under his rise to become Prime Minister and President. He's also put in charge of the KGB in this period. So the guy who wasn't a very successful KGB officer gets put in charge of the KGB for a period. And while he's in the KGB, he creates basically a financial monitoring system and takes away all the powers from the KGB itself and creates a new unit there, which he then takes with him when he becomes president, the Russian Financial Monitoring Service. And they have the motherlode of information on everybody, absolutely everybody. Who's, not paid their taxes, kind of who's acquired this asset, what everybody's done with everything. So the whole system is based on mutually assured destruction. And I think that's why sometimes those, basically messages about Putin come out as well. Everybody is stolen, some much more than others, and everybody can be hung. It's the kind of the whole idea of we all, rise together and we fall together. So it's kind of, basically the nuclear option in the system. If anybody reveals what Putin has, they all go together. And then there's one final element, being the new Tsar. The heads of a state, particularly, kind of the traditional state, were always supposed to be the biggest and the richest of all. Everybody in Britain always talks about the Queen of England being the richest person in the world. We actually know that she's not anymore because, we have the Forbes billionaires list in any case, and she's not right there at the top. Putin's not there at the top either. But the whole idea is that if he's the president of Russia, it's kind of shock and awe. He's got to have more money than anyone else because Yeltsin in 1996 was completely broke. Even though his family had definitely been acquiring assets as well, there wasn't much to acquire. The state was broke, they were broke, and they had to make a deal with the oligarchs to get Yeltsin re-elected to run his campaign. He wasn't like Donald Trump, he didn't have billions, he wasn't like Bernie Sanders, he couldn't get a grassroots campaign together. Now when Putin sits opposite, basically people that he has to deal with, they all know that he's got more money and he can't be touched. So I think the whole issue is very complicated. We see it from our perspective, but their system, and as you say, a lot of Russian friends are very cynical about this. They all assume that everybody steals. And so what's interesting is every time there's an announcement about Putin's billions, there's just a kind of collective shrug among the Russian population. But there might not be a collective shrug when people start to feel that their pocketbooks have been hurt. And that could become another element, I think, in the political problems for Putin down the line. There was a question over here, sir.
What do you think Putin's reaction and what happens to Russia if the United States starts supplying Europe with the natural gas they need and they stop buying it from Russia?
Putin was actually very nervous about that for a while. I think with low oil prices, gas prices, it's not likely that we'll be able to do that. Putin, for a long period, up until about 2011, was pretty dismissive about shale gas. I was actually at an event that Putin spoke at where he was just dissing fracking. So it was ridiculous, and that the US would never really kind of pull all of this off. Well, it was a bit of a shock just as he's coming back into the presidency in 2012, when the United States actually suddenly starts talking again about exporting oil and gas, and the whole discussions in Congress and elsewhere about making that happen. Unfortunately, however, it was a bit of a long shot. As at current oil and gas prices, it's very unlikely that we'd be able to do that. The biggest problem for Putin has actually been in the European front, the European Union getting its act together. The European Union has been quite effective, and it's not often that people talk about the European Union as being very effective these days. Since 2006 and 2009, when the gas cut-off to Ukraine happened, in actually starting to take measures to make it more difficult for Russia to use gas as a weapon. So a lot of more diversification, liquefied natural gas, LNG, from other places and around. Obviously, the problems in Libya and elsewhere have been a bit problematic for that, but trying to get more LNG terminals and LNG from a broader range of countries that would have included the United States. Building connectors, connecting pipelines to countries that actually were most hit when the gas was turned off to Ukraine, countries that also got their gas directly from Russia through the Ukrainian pipeline network. And also trying to increase efficiency of energy use to try to make sure that the demand for gas doesn't start to increase. So the European Union has also created something called the Third Energy Packet, which is an attempt to liberalise the energy markets. So to stop countries or companies like Russia's Gazprom from basically monopolising the production of the gas, the distribution of the gas and the sales of the gas to the customers on the other end. And the Russians have fought against this or tried to fight against this, but reluctantly they've basically had to go along with it. So we see actually a much more diversified, a more complex market in Europe, where the United States might eventually become part of the picture. But it's really that broader ability now to tap into LNG and gas and oil from a whole host of other suppliers that has really made the big difference here. But this is definitely, again, another of the worries for Putin about whether Russia will maintain its dominance of the European market. So again, something else that's been watched very closely. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm wondering how you see Putin managing Russia's relations with China and how that might affect the West.
Well, that fits actually in somewhat to the question really about energy. Because for a while, when it looked like the United States might start to become competition for Russia, Russia wanted to threaten the Europeans with the kind of idea that, okay, I'm just going to pick up my gas and I'm going to move and go to China, which is, of course, easier said than done. You can't just do it, overnight. And China has actually been rather a hard bargainer with the Russians for trying to purchase their gas. Russia has been thinking about selling gas to China for some considerable period of time and in a way has missed the boat. The Chinese have got lots of options of supply, including from Malaysia, Australia, and parts of the Asia-Pacific region. And the Chinese have a lot of coal, as we know. We're very concerned about that for climate change and global warming issues. But the Russians have been caught now by the Chinese trying to basically index gas sales to coal prices. So there's been a long negotiation with the Chinese over this. But overall, the Russians have been trying to court China in many different ways since 2000. There's the idea of China as the great rising power that will kind of pull Russia with it. In fact, one of the main reasons that Russia grew so fast between 2000 and 2008 in its economy was the huge demand for commodities, not just oil and gas, but all commodities out of China. And so China has been a huge factor in Russia's growth since Putin came into power. China, of course, has been a long-term threat to Russia and the Soviet Union, dating back to the Soviet period, but even back to the Russian imperial period. Russia seized rather a lot of what was Chinese territory in the 1860s, just north of the Amur River in the Russian Far East. And if you go to China, as some of you might have done, and you look at Chinese maps, you'll notice there's a bit of a bleeding of the colour from the country colour for China just north of there. So I was in a Chinese institute a couple of years ago. I obviously don't read Chinese, but I was looking at the map rather curiously, and I asked my Chinese counterpart if that was the Amur River, and I said yes. And I said, so what's this further north? He said, old Greater China. I was like, oh, okay, maybe future China, at some point, which of course is a great concern. And then in the late 1960s, there were clashes between the Soviet Union and China over that territory around the Amur River. So the Russian government, even under Boris Yeltsin, was very quick to try to smooth out relations with China. And in 2000, one of the first acts that Putin did was to basically negotiate and regularize the border between Russia and China on the Amur River, because the border kept shifting as the river shifted, and to try to agree on where that border would be. And so Putin's put a lot of effort into creating a strategic partnership with China. Politically very important to counterbalance the United States, has been important for China as well. But over the longer term, there's a lot of questions about how that relationship might play out. It's not just that they've been playing hardball with Russia about gas prices, but also China has already been investing quite heavily in another part of Russia's old neighbourhood in Central Asia, building gas pipelines and oil export pipelines there as well. China now has this new idea of infrastructure development, the One Belt, One Road that was announced this past year by President Xi, and has been creating this big new bank, the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, to really start to construct a lot of rail and roadways and other facilities, port facilities, out across Central Asia into Europe. And the Russians are getting now just a little bit nervous that China is eventually going to be competing with them in economic development. And just recently, there was an announcement that the Russians have actually agreed to create a new railway linking some of their territory into Chinese territory for trade purposes. The Chinese have forced the Russians to build on an international gauge. Russia is famous for having its own railway gauge, you know, the width of the railway lines, that if you actually travel into Russia by train, you have to change trains to go across the territory. I mean, I think it's probably fair enough, they do have the world's largest territory. But it's very significant that they've agreed to actually create a new gauge railway from Russia to China, which shows that, you know, they're having to actually adapt themselves to the rise of China. And then there's one other element that is worrying the Russians, is the Arctic. The Chinese are building a whole new fleet of icebreakers, and Russia likes to think of itself as the master of the Arctic, because of course it has the most territory inside of the Arctic Circle. And if the northern seas will become ice-free for periods during the summer, there's a lot of prospects for commercial shipping. Well, the Russians don't really have a very good commercial shipping fleet. They have lots of military equipment, and so you're seeing them really militarising the Arctic at the moment. And part of that is because they're worried about the Chinese moving into the Arctic and establishing shipping lines from essentially the Asia-Pacific all the way through to Iceland and Greenland and down into Europe, which seems to be very much a Chinese ambition. So right now we see Russia and China, in a political sense, seemingly strategic partners, but over the longer term there's all kinds of frictions there that might make that relationship quite complicated too, and make it seem less for Russia as an alternative to really dealing with the United States and Europe. Do we have time for another question?
Yeah.
One more? Yes. Here at the front. Thank you.
I'm with the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Forum, and I'm
really?
the person who
Oh,
showed up
fantastic.
last.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
So I'm glad I'm here
Yeah.
tonight. Glad you're here tonight. But follow-up question on China relative to Japan. Obviously, Portsmouth Peace Treaty, Russia and Japan.
Yeah.
Is all of what you just said about China helpful or hindering or both contribution to the relationship between Russia and Japan? Prime Minister Abe is in Russia this week. The Kuril Islands are still up in the sea, and neither side is in control. I don't see the Putin that you describe in your book as giving up any territory. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think this is a really interesting development that's going to play out in real time with Abe really trying to court Putin. And it is about China. So I was in Japan just a year ago when there was first an announcement that Abe was going to try to meet with Putin. In fact, Putin had been invited to come to Japan. And there have been many discussions around various anniversaries of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, for example, talking about the idea that Japan and Russia should finally conclude a peace treaty from another war, from World War II. And also, too, as you know, this whole debate about how to resolve the Kuril Islands, the Northern Territories, which the Soviet Union seized from Japan in the very last days of the war. The problem for Japan is that Russia knows that Japan is very vulnerable at the moment, and Putin likes to exploit vulnerabilities. This is part of that working with people and working with information aspect of Putin. And again, this negative kind of approach to things. Japan sees China right now as an existential threat, and while I was in Japan it was made very clear. And they look around the Asia-Pacific, and the only friend that they really have is the United States. And there's starting to be a bit of a worry, you know, kind of the back of heads in Japan as to whether the United States will be there in the event of a clash with China over the Senkaku Islands or any other issue. And they've been watching very closely our political campaign and the idea that, you know, kind of alliances might not be what they used to be in the event of a President Trump. And even prospective President Clinton coming out against the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal, which is very important to Japan. And the Russians keep telling them, well, you're right, the United States will never really be there for you. You might need us. So Putin has been sort of telling the Japanese that they should kind of forget about this whole Coral Island business. We can be friends without all of that. He's actually said that the Coral Islands, he's not going to resolve them, exactly as you suggest. At different times he's hinted to them that he might, but recently he's come out quite openly and said, no, we're not going to basically resolve this. In 1956, at another peace conference for us to end the war with Japan in San Francisco, the Soviet Union actually undertook to potentially return 2 of the Coral Islands back to Japan at some point in the event of a peace treaty. And Putin said, not so fast, even maybe not that now, but we'd have to discuss this, which is, of course, making the Japanese feel extraordinarily nervous. It means that Abe won't get very much out of the meetings. But what Russia is suggesting to the Japanese is that potentially they could help craft a new security arrangement in the Asia-Pacific that would bring Japan and China, using their relationship, their close relationship with China, that would put Japan in a better position. So there's a lot of flirting going on by Putin, a lot of manipulation of Japanese fears. And the Japanese really do feel that, okay, there might be all these frictions that I and many others keep talking about Russia and China down the line, but right now, for them in the Asia-Pacific, this is incredibly dangerous. And so Abe very much wants to find some way of improving the relationship with Russia and seeing if there might be some way of moving forward. The Russians, however, would like to have a lot of investment in the Russian Far East, and it's not really very clear that the Japanese will want to do that at this particular junction. They would like to have Japan as an alternative to China for the gas, and then they would like to get the Japanese to pay to build new pipelines and other infrastructure out in the Russian Far East. This is going to be a very delicate and very difficult set of meetings, and I think we should watch it very closely. But anyway, I'm really glad you came again. I'm very sorry for the lost time, and thank you everybody for all of your patience and